The amendments that we put forward were necessary to try and fix this terrible piece of legislation. This will effectively kill the natural resource sector in Canada's economy.
When will he realize that his policies are phasing out the energy sector and all the jobs that go with it?
The federal government is rejecting nearly all the amendments made by Conservative senators to Bill C-69. That bill is the government's plan to overhaul how resource projects get approved in this country. But some critics have called it the No Pipeline Act. And yesterday, 6 premiers told the Prime Minister that passing Bill C-69 without all of the Senate's amendments would threaten national unity. Today, the government did accept 62 of the Senate's amendments and will also accept 37 others with some tweaks. But the bulk of the Conservative amendments are being tossed. So are the feds prepared for the fallout? Catherine McKenna is the Minister of Environment and Climate Change. She joins us now in studio. Hi, Minister. Nice to see you.
Great to see you.
Thanks for coming in. So, Bill C-69, 6 premiers wrote the Prime Minister. They said if all the amendments were not adopted, that it would sort of threaten national unity. Do they have a point?
Look, I assume the premiers want what our government wants, which is better rules for environmental assessments. You're protecting the environment, you have the trust of the public, you're meeting your obligations to consult and accommodate Indigenous peoples, and that good projects go ahead in a timely way. That's exactly what we've done. We looked at amendments from the Senate. There were some amendments that would improve the bill, and so we, accepted those. But let's be clear what we weren't going to accept are 90% of the amendments that were from Conservative senators that were attempting to gut the bill. They wanted to go back to the time of Stephen Harper. And let's be clear.
What does gut the bill mean?
Gut the bill means limiting the ability of the public to provide input. It means trying to make it optional to consult with Indigenous peoples, which you cannot do. It means removing environmental protections. It means politicizing the process. It means everything that was the problem with the bill in the first place. And the irony about all this is that if you want good projects to go ahead, you need to make sure that you're doing right by the environment, that you're consulting with Indigenous peoples, that public have trust, and of course, that good projects go ahead in a timely way, because otherwise you end up in court. You can look at it with Trans Mountain expansion. We ended up in the situation we were in where the challenges were on the environmental side, Indigenous consultation side, because of the old system. It was under Stephen Harper.
Well, it was actually your government's decision to adopt the way in which Indigenous consultations were conducted.
But let's be clear that this was under CIA 2012, which was Stephen Harper's system. And this whole bill, with Bill C-69, we took 3.5 years. We did 2 parliamentary committees. We had 2 expert panels. We heard from industry, we heard from Indigenous peoples, we heard from environmentalists, we heard from provinces, we heard from Canadians. We took that input and we've created a very good system. And I think it's really now time for premiers, for businesses, for the Conservative Party to come together and say that we have a great system. Investment is already up in our country. We've created a million jobs.
Not in the oil patch, to be fair. FDI across the country is up, but that's not driven by capital investment in the oil patch. In fact, capital investment in the oil patch, at least according to CAP, has fled.
Well, we had the largest investment in Canada's history, liquefied natural gas. That's tens of thousands of jobs. As I say, largest investment in our history. Created 1 million jobs with Canadians. And the only way you're going to go forward with major projects in the 21st century, if you get it right, that you have to consult with the public, that you have to make sure you're protecting the environment, that you need to properly consult and accommodate Indigenous peoples. And we've created a process that is more timely, that provides more ability to work directly with provinces. So we think this is a great project, this is a great law, and we really need to now go out and sell it and tell the world we have a $500 billion opportunity over the next decade. And Canadians should be saying, this is a great system, come invest in Canada.
How do you know that the world is going to listen and just going to trust what you're saying about what this bill will accomplish as far as certainty goes? What the industry was saying and what politicians that express themselves in this letter are saying is that you can't say that for certain. You don't know that things are going to get better with what you're proposing. And in fact, at a time of such uncertainty in the oil patch, I take your point on LNG, I take your point on FDI across the country, but at a time of such uncertainty in the oil patch, creating anything that would continue or amplify that uncertainty is really a dangerous thing.
I think that to the extent Conservative politicians and oil lobbyists have that perspective,
they represent. I mean, Conservative politicians represent people who live in provinces that depend on that oil and jobs in that sector. The oil lobby represents companies that also depend on that. Rachel Notley said the same thing that Jason Kenney was saying about this bill.
Well, I mean, let's be clear. Andrew Scheer had secret meetings with oil lobbyists. We have seen the amendments from the Conservatives reflect exactly those amendments. But that's not the point.
Have you never met with an oil lobbyist?
I've met with, of course.
Have you met with
I've met with, yes, but we're not designing a bill for oil lobbyists. We're designing a bill that...
No, but you're insinuating because he met with them that they're in the pocket of the oil lobby. I mean, politicians all meet with oil
Well,
lobbyists.
I mean, the amendments that they put forward represent those amendments. Having said that, I work with lots of good companies, and they understand. I spent a lot of time working internationally. I lived in Indonesia doing oil and gas law, interestingly, internationally. That in the 21st century, you have to have a process that protects the environment. Good companies know this. You need a process that's going to provide certainty. Of course, you need it to be timely, but you can't pretend that you can ram through projects. And Andrew Scheer released his policy. It was a pipeline approval process as opposed to a review of environmental impacts on projects. That's not going to help us move forward. That's not going to help get our resources to market. And the proof point is Stephen Harper's system. It didn't work. It increased polarization. It didn't ensure that good projects go ahead, and it certainly didn't have the public trust.
When you talk about moving forward, this bill, C-48, from a legislative perspective, how crucial is it? Like, are you leaving on Friday if those bills aren't passed?
Look, we have done what we have said as a government. We were elected an agenda to rebuild trust in major projects. We went through the whole process, the consultation process. This is part of my mandate letter. It was supported by the House. So I think the Senate has a very important role, yes, to provide suggestions for improving the bill, but we need to get this legislation through, and we need it as much to attract investment as we do to protect the environment. We've got a good bill, and I'm certainly hopeful that the Senate will accept the proposals, the message that we sent. That's what you call it, a message, because we accepted the good amendments, and we certainly appreciate those senators that were thoughtful and thought about how do we strengthen and improve the bill.
Does that mean, though, just to be clear, that you're willing to do whatever you have to legislatively, to use whatever tools possible to get both of these bills passed? I'm asking because I had Minister Chagger on yesterday. She sort of insinuated that at least where C-48 is concerned, it's part of a bigger environmental package, so nothing hinges, completely on one bill or the other. But I want to know clearly, are you willing to rise without these bills made into law?
No.
Okay. Thank you, Minister. Appreciate it.
So, Mr. Speaker, the only person responsible for endangering national unity is this Prime Minister. Right. When will he do the right thing and kill Bill C-69?
Once again, it is his Conservative Premier friends who brought up the issue of national unity if they didn't get their way. And they want to double down on Stephen Harper's failed approach. We know that the environment and the economy must go together in the 21st century.
The federal government is accepting some of the more than 180 amendments the Senate proposed for Bill C-69. That's the bill that would aim to overhaul the environmental review process for major energy projects. 62 Senate amendments were accepted as is. Another 37 were accepted with some tweaks. But the bulk of the Conservative amendments were rejected. How significant are the changes the government went through with, and will the changes be enough to get Conservative parliamentarians and many premiers on side? It's time for the Power Panel. In Calgary, political strategist Anne McGrath. Amanda Alvaro of Pomp and Circumstance is in Toronto. Here with me in studio, Summa Strategies' Tim Powers and Le Devoir's Marie Vastel. Hi, everybody.
Nice. Hello.
Amanda, why don't I start with you, because we had Minister McKenna on, and she said that these two bills, C-48 and C-69, are so important that the House will not rise without passing them into law. Why are they so significant for the government? And what do you make of the amendments that they have accepted versus rejected?
Well, let's go back to why Bill C-69 existed in the first place. I mean, it's a direct response to the fact that previous governments, decade worth of previous government, wasn't able to get these big projects built. And they weren't able to get them built because they weren't able to engage communities effectively. They didn't have environmental considerations in place. Nothing got done. So now what they'd like to do is strip away all the measures in the current bill to ram through these changes putting them back exactly in the same place that we would be in, into lawsuits, only worse. And I think that this is a really good, solid territory for the Liberal government to be on, because they're saying we'll accept many of these amendments as proposed by the Senate. We will not accept the amendments that talk about process that engages communities. Because we need to engage Indigenous communities, we need to do it effectively, and we need to make sure that all of those environmental considerations are in place so we actually get these pipelines built. Well,
they sort of, Tim, accepted some of those types of amendments. They basically gave the assessment agency more power in deciding ultimately who will contribute. Those are some of the amendments they agreed with, but they're in disagreement with some of the language changes proposed around Indigenous consultation.
Yeah, and this whole notion that Indigenous peoples weren't consulted before is just not right. I mean, it's been Canadian law since the 1990s on a number of different fronts that Indigenous people rightly ought to be consulted and have significant sway over whether projects get developed or not. So that's a bit of a red herring.
What the courts established was that it wasn't meaningful in the case of TMX.
But it has existed.
Yes,
so there's the suggestion that it didn't exist, and I think Amanda touched on that a little bit, is not right. Can it be more meaningful? Any consultation could be more meaningful, but I don't think that's the issue. I think Amanda ended where the Liberals want the frame to be. The Liberals want the election to be in large measure about the environment and environmental policy as they see it compared to Conservatives and the way they believe Conservatives see it. So C-69 has become less about the actual policy and more a symbolic exercise of demarcation. But there's some problems in these amendments, or the lack of accepting some of them, for the Liberals. One specific example, in their backyard, they're not accepting an amendment that would see some of the regulatory oversight boards that the governments already control, like the Canada-Newfoundland Offshore Petroleum Board, play a role in all of this. This has been a side discussion and a huge irritant in Atlantic Canada within the Liberal caucus. I think it's also important to correct the record a little bit. While it is true that the Conservatives never got a pipeline to Tidewater, they did get some big projects like the Alberta Clipper approved.
4 pipelines, they say,
yeah,
right?
And they weren't insignificant projects, but this is about demarcating the lines on both sides of the issue. And why do they want to get it done? They can't not leave it undone, because the problem the Liberals will have politically is many of their supporters, particularly in some of the environmental groups that they have who've been on side since the beginning, will be pretty unhappy if this isn't done, and they may lose their support and their activism during the election campaign. That's why Minister McKenna is pushing this so hard now.
And you advise, of course, former Premier Rachel Notley. Rachel Notley and Jason Kenney kind of aligned on this issue in the lead up to the Senate's debate on the amendments and the acceptance of the amendments. What is the feeling in Alberta about what the government put forth today?
Well, I would say that the feeling in Alberta about Bill C-69 and C-48 is visceral. Particularly C-69, it's the kind of issue where people on the street know what C-69 is, and they know that it is actually known as the No More Pipelines bill. It is true that neither the Conservatives nor the Liberals have been successful in getting any pipeline projects to Tidewater, and I think that what we're ending up with in this kind of mishmash is nobody will be happy. I think many environmental groups and First Nations groups that oppose it will be upset at what they will see as a watering down, and pipeline proponents, which includes many Indigenous communities, pipeline proponents will see this as a kind of a contradiction. A lot of people in Alberta wonder why the federal government would buy the pipeline and then put in place legislation that makes it impossible to proceed.
Interesting. Marie, what do you think? What do you think the implications for are politically? And I ask you about the federal government specifically because we're expecting on June 18th, of course, the decision from Cabinet on TMX.
Well, I agree with Anne that I think there will be discontent on both sides. That being said, when you talk to environmental groups over the past week or so after the Senate had amended the bill, they were quite concerned about some of the conservative amendments, as the government calls them, that have been rejected. So I do think today they are somewhat reassured that, for example, you have to factor in, it's not optional to factor in Indigenous knowledge or consultations, or it's not optional to allow anyone who wants to be consulted, things like that. I think satisfies them. I think the industry is upset and they will remain upset. I think maybe the biggest political question mark, or one of the biggest political question marks, is what the provinces are going to do. As Anne said, Alberta is vehemently opposed to the bill. Jason Kenney has threatened to go to court to contest the bill. I wonder if other provinces might feel the same way in the next few days and might say, yeah, we'll join a court challenge against this. And the government keeps saying it's conservative provinces. Well, that's not completely true. Newfoundland, which is a Liberal premier, Quebec, which is a CAQ, Coalition Avenir Québec premier, also opposed parts of this bill. Quebec mostly on provincial jurisdiction issues, but Newfoundland and Quebec, with Alberta and others, were worried about discretionary powers that the minister had. Those have been taken out in the new version of the bill, where that's some of the amendments that the government accepted. But I do wonder how much having a lot of provinces upset at the federal government forcing this down their throat will impact the election and the way forward, especially when this is a government who keeps having electoral promises that depend on provincial collaboration and that sometimes impede on provincial jurisdiction.
Well, and just picking, look, I think all of us would agree there is some theatrics in the Premier's letter about national unity, but there's also, but there's also reality in it too. I think everybody can be accused of being a bit theatrical here, the Prime Minister included even, Amanda. I know he usually isn't like that at all, but the inequality is what people are really feeling. I think Marie was talking to that. If you're in a province where a lot of your economic opportunity comes from a resource-based economy, and that resource-based economy continues to encounter hurdles, no matter how worthy some may perceive those hurdles to be, and you can't work, that causes significant discontent. We've seen that throughout history, if your economic opportunity is limited. So yes, well, it's important to act and act in the best interests of the environment. These premiers are also dealing with the economic reality of the day and their treasury and their people.
I get that, but the only question I would have, and the one I had for the premiers yesterday, is upon what historical examples are you predicating the assumption that this environmental assessment process will impede the construction of any pipeline? The environmental assessment process in the past has actually allowed for most projects to go through. I get the concerns over too much input and the minister having too much discretion, but like, how do you know for sure this is going to make it so much worse?
Yeah.
Not an expert in that area, but I'll give you something that I believe is analogous, and that is when you have significant jurisdictional oversight. So, and I think this is a legitimate concern of 2 governments, 3 governments, Indigenous governments, all in there. I think it's pretty fair to say that that slows things down. Fights in the past around resources between provinces, you look at the offshore, you look at oil, you look at the fisheries, have all been about too many hands in there, no one clear direction. And the amendments that got turned down that were quite interesting, that are relevant, I think, the one by CAP, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, was about investor certainty. And I think that's a fair argument. As much as people may find that offensive in some circles, people don't spend money unless they know there's going to be a return. And I think this is what the provinces are saying.
And they're not. I mean, Amanda, there is, sorry, I'll get to you in a second, Anne. I was just going to say that there, I mean, according to some numbers put out by CAP, but otherwise looked at as well, there is a very much so a tangible capital flight in the oil patch. I know that the federal government, Amanda, keeps pointing to FDI numbers across the country, which certainly they have a point there, but there is a lot of flight out of the oil patch, and the concern is that this will accelerate that.
Yeah, and I think it's also really important to get down to it in its simplest terms. This is a government who wants to build pipelines. They want to build them so badly that they bought one. But you can't just build a pipeline to Tidewater in this country. There are other considerations at play. And unless you want to find yourself in a lawsuit that prevents that from happening, these are the measures that need to be in place to do that. Environmental considerations, true, meaningful engagement with communities. So when you talk about discontentment, Tim, on the side of industry, you have to weigh that and balance that with discontentment on the other side. On the side of communities that haven't felt meaningfully consulted, you have to also consider all of those environmental measures that need to be in place. And this bill is allowing that to happen so that pipelines can finally get built in this country.
And quick final word to you.
So the former Notley NDP government was completely completely in support of and a proponent of meaningful consultation with Indigenous communities and with environmental groups. They were actually pushing for that kind of consultation. This bill, though, I think does make it very difficult for any pipelines to proceed, and there is a strong sense of hypocrisy, a feeling that, for instance, many Albertans support the LNG projects in British Columbia, but wonder why it is that with our industry and our economy and our province, we have so much difficulty. Even when there is the consultation that is necessary, we still don't seem to be able to get progress.
I cannot believe that a Prime Minister would be prepared to push forward a bill that strikes at the heart of Canadian unity and at the same time the economy of Canada. That's just unprecedented. That bill just needs to die.
The federal government plans to reject nearly all the amendments made by Conservative senators to Bill C-69. That bill is the government's plan to overhaul how resource projects get approved in this country. But some critics have called it the No Pipeline Act. And yesterday, 6 premiers told the Prime Minister that passing Bill C-69 without all of the Senate's amendments would threaten national unity. Today, the government did accept 62 of the Senate's amendments and will also accept 37 others with tweaks. But the bulk of the Conservative ones were tossed. So what will the Senate do now? Doug Black is an Alberta independent senator. He joins me now. Hi, Senator. Nice to see you.
Thank you for having me here.
Thanks for being here. So let me start off by asking you about the amendments that the government did introduce, because many of them address some of the concerns that senators heard throughout the process. Yep. They traveled the country. They listened to a lot of witnesses. They introduced amendments that up the power of the provinces, that up the power of the Impact Assessment Agency, and that limit the power of the minister. Isn't that what you heard from people who were worried about this bill? They address that.
It is some of what we heard, and yes, they address some of the issues. But when you step back, let's consider what we have to achieve here. We want projects built in Canada. We want investment to return to Canada. We want the closed for business sign out of the window, and we want any threat to national unity eradicated. These amendments don't do it. We always said that it's the package of Senate amendments that will potentially get it done for natural resource projects. This is just not the oil and gas industry. This is cable ferries, this is ports, this is airports, this is electricity lines, it's nuclear facilities, it's 20% of the Canadian economy. And what have we been doing the last number of months? We've talked to thousands of people. The committee's heard from hundreds of people. We've now heard from 6 premiers. We've heard from every Chamber of Commerce in Canada, Aboriginal groups, environmental groups. Was this just all a game?
But isn't it important not only to address the concerns around the economy, to address the concerns around the investment climate, but to also address those concerns coming from those who want more stringent environmental protection?
Absolutely.
Who are worried about that, who are worried,
Absolutely.
for example, from Indigenous people who are concerned about their rights being trampled on. Isn't the government tasked with striking a balance between all of those concerns, and did they not do that with this?
Yes, they are tasked with achieving a balance, and no, they did not achieve it. There is nobody stronger than the natural resource industry who understands the necessity to make sure that consultations are meaningful and that the environment is respected. Canada is a leader in that field globally. I mean, compare us to anybody else who does natural resource projects around the world. We are the standard. So there is nobody suggesting, and it's disingenuous to suggest, that to achieve building projects is to somehow compromise on consultation or on environmental matters. That is simply not right. It is not our practice. It is not our history on any project in Canada, regardless of what people will say.
Although the courts did, for example, with TMX say the process that was in place was not meaningful enough. So what the government says that it's doing is encoding in this legislation a process that will stand up in courts.
That's what the government is saying, but specifically in respect of Trans Mountain, what the court said was 2 things. They said, 1, you didn't spend enough time worrying about the whales in the strait, the waters off of Vancouver. That was never scoped. That was never intended to be done. Should it have been done? Maybe. So it's now been done. And the consultation that was flawed was the Government of Canada's consultation. That's what it was. 6 groups. It was the Government of Canada. So for the Government of Canada now to be lecturing industry from coast to coast about their need to consult is frankly a little rich.
But are they lecturing, or are they trying to sort of encode what the courts decided. You know, what the court said basically. Here's a little bit more of a prescriptive roadmap as to what meaningful consultation is. So they're saying let's adopt that in a legislative framework so that we don't end up in this place again. I take your point about it being on them.
I take your point that there's not bad will behind this on the part of the government. There is. I've never suggested there's bad will. They've just got it wrong. It's not practical. It's not pragmatic. It's not going to work.
So what?
But I don't doubt the intent is good.
So what happens now? Because we had Minister McKenna on a little bit earlier on the show. She was unequivocal, and she said that the House will not rise until Bill C-48, that's the tanker ban on the northern coast of BC, and Bill C-69 are passed. So what mechanism do senators have left, if any?
Well, we can go back with additional amendments. I mean, we can play ping pong all summer. It won't happen that way. I think that there's an understanding that this package of amendments will accommodate most senators' interests. And I'm afraid to say that I believe the bill, as currently proposed, maybe there'll be an additional tweak here and there, but I'm afraid that this bill is going to pass. And, you know, the consequences will be what the consequences will be.
I have another question for you about another bill, because this is from Senator Ronna Ambrose. Her bill is before the Senate, and that's the bill, just for our viewers, so that they understand. We've had her on the show before to talk about it, but it's essentially a bill that would make sexual assault training mandatory for judges. She tweeted today that she's been told that her party will block all legislation, including her bill, to make sure that the UNDRIP bill that's before the Senate, which is C-262, passes. Do you think that will happen?
This is a very complicated question. This is a complicated stew and quite a nasty recipe. The answer is I don't know. Okay. I think there is a feeling that there is going to be no private members' bills passed by the time we rise, but there's tremendous opposition to that. There's a lot of folks that believe that Ms. Ambrose's bill is a good bill and should get through. There's certainly a number of senators who have a very strong view on ensuring that the UNDRIP bill gets through, and there's a number of senators who have a different view. So,
what's your position?
It's a mud wrestle.
What's your position? Are you willing to?
On which bill?
Well, on Ms. Ambrose's bill. Are you willing?
It doesn't hurt. Yeah. Like, is it going to make a substantial difference whether we educate judges further in terms of, you know, sexual harassment issues? It can't hurt. Is it going to help substantially? I don't think it's going to help substantially.
Why don't you think so?
Because I think that the majority of judges have a real understanding of the issues that surround them. That's been my experience. I'm a lawyer, and that's my experience. There's always a bad apple or two. There's always a bad apple or two. But it can't hurt. Information can't hurt.
Those bad apples were pretty bad, though.
They were bad
cases
apples.
That prompted, right?
No, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. So that's my view. If it makes a difference at the margin, why not?
Are you opposed to sort of any kind of antics that might happen, any kind of procedural, I guess you could call them, quote unquote, antics that, because of the desire of some senators to make sure that the UNDRIP bill does not pass, would limit those private members' bills?
I am always opposed to antics. I'm from Alberta. We're straight down the line. I find the games and the antics exhausting and unproductive.
So you won't participate in them?
I'm not smart enough to.
All right, Senator Black, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it. Hi, I'm Vashi Kapelos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video. Thanks for watching.